What's up, guys? Enkiri here. Today, my dear subscribers, I'm going to tell you all about one of my favorite posterior chain exercises. A fantastic exercise that strengthens and hypertrophies the glutes, the hamstrings, and the lower back, that boosts deadlifting power, that decreases the likelihood of ever suffering a lower back injury, and that does so far better than the majority of more commonly practiced posterior chain assistance exercises. The problem is, most of you have probably scarcely performed this exercise at all, and those of you that do include it don't load it nearly heavy enough to see any of the benefits I'm talking about. But today, I plan to change that. So let's get to it. The exercise I'm alluding to is, of course, the classic, frequently vilified and often butchered hyperextension, also known as the back raise. The thing about this exercise is, people take the name too fucking literally. But it's a misnomer, because the fact is a proper hyperextension doesn't actually involve any lumbar hyperextension or flexion or raising, or for that matter, any movement at all. In fact, the lower back should remain entirely neutral throughout the exercise, with all the joint motion taking place at the hips. This makes the movement remarkably similar to a stiff-legged deadlift or an RDL, but with much less risk and overall negative stress to the lower back, and a much greater propensity for accruing high levels of quality volume, which in time will lead to more hypertrophy and more strength. Yet, the hyperextension bench continues to gather dust in gyms around the country, and the few people who do utilize it seem hell-bent on either overextending their lumbar spine so far that they can touch their heels with the back of their head, or loading it with such paltry weights, that is, if they even load it at all, that they have to do 50 reps before they even realize they're training a muscle. The former is idiotic and is going to hurt you eventually, and the latter, to be quite blunt, is simply pointless. So how can we take this exercise, which, through no fault of its own, but rather through the fault of ignorance and poor execution, has been vilified as one that tweaks lower backs, degenerates lumbar discs, and should generally just be avoided, and move it to its rightful place at the top of the list of most effective go-to assistance exercises for the posterior chain? Let's start by covering the two most common issues I've seen with this exercise, as well as their remedies, and then we'll finish up by doing a brief overview of how to safely perform the exercise for maximal strength, hypertrophy, and athletic performance, while minimizing risk to the lower back. Nearly every person other than myself who I've seen do this exercise does the same damn thing. They rely almost exclusively on flexing and extending their lower back to create movement. In the bottom, instead of keeping a neutral spine and getting a nice stretch in the hand knees, they flex the lumbar spine. In that same vein, they then have to extend it in order to move it back up. However, they don't stop there. Once they reach the top and have once again achieved neutral, they take it a step further by overarching their lower back into as much hyperextension as they can possibly muster, only to jolt back down into flexion once more. Like I said earlier, the name is a misnomer. You should neither use your lower back to raise your torso from the bottom position, nor should you hyperextend it to push yourself up at the top. Instead, you should keep a neutral spine the whole way through and focus on flexing and extending the hips in isolation. Which, as an aside, is part of the beauty of this movement in the first place that separates it from some of the barbell lifts that attempt to isolate hip flexion and extension. In a stiff-legged deadlift or an RDL or a good morning, the goal is essentially to isolate hip flexion. Yet, in these movements, it's nearly impossible to separate it from knee flexion and extension unless you're using weights that are simply too light to be meaningful. The hyperextension does not have this problem. But back to the main point now. If you use the hips properly, your hamstrings will be put under an immense amount of stress and stretch as you lower yourself down into the bottom. And the stretch reflex they create will help to propel you back up until the glutes, not the fucking lower back, are called upon to finish locking the hips out into a fully extended, but not hyperextended position. You can hold each rep at the top for a second or two if you're a real masochist. The lower back simply remains neutral this entire time and functions as a force transmitter in a static fashion, i.e., it has to work very hard to maintain a neutral position, especially as you repeatedly increase the length of the lever arm acting against it by raising your torso to an erect position. But it's in your best interest to keep it neutral, because the tighter it remains, the more force you'll be able to transmit through it from your glutes and hamstrings and into your torso. A non-neutral lower back is an energy leak, and trading the glutes for the lower back is a raw deal when it comes to strength, aesthetics, performance, and health. If you execute this correctly, not only will your lower back become much stronger and more resilient, but so will the rest of your posterior chain as well. The other prominent issue I see with this exercise is treating it like it's some dainty bullshit. Advanced lifters seem to think it's remedial and ineffective, and beginners treat it like it's an endurance builder. Both of these notions stem from the same problem. People are simply not loading it heavy enough. It needs to be treated like any other strength and mass builder, and that means loading it with enough weight that you definitely can't do more than 12 reps with it, while also probably exploring going as low as 5 reps. If you look at someone like Pete Rubish, he seems to have almost treated it like a primary exercise at times, and has definitely done it for heavy triples and maybe even maxed out on it. I'm pretty sure he's used over 400 pounds before. Now, he does it in a way that's a little different from what I advocate and would lend itself slightly better to lower reps. But as a man who's deadlifted over 900 pounds, you certainly can't argue with his results. The fact is, for years, he has consistently loaded the damn thing up as heavy as he possibly could, and it's evident that he has one of the strongest backs in the world. Personally, I've experimented with going as high as 220 pounds for a set of 6 so far, and I plan to work that up much higher because I've only recently started experimenting with very heavy weights on this exercise, and I spent months building up a solid base where I routinely use between 150 and 180 pounds for multiple sets of 8 to 12 reps at the tail end of a workout. In fact, at one point last year, for a period of about 6 months, I did nothing but weighted hypers a few times a week as my only posterior chain exercise. And this was at a time when I only had access to dumbbells that maxed out at 150 pounds. And at the end of that 6-month period, I still maintained a 520 pound deadlift at 155 pounds just by doing hyperextensions. Now I have access to a dumbbell that can basically go as heavy as I want it to. And I'm working heavy hypers back into my routine and have since deadlifted 550 pounds for 3 reps, again at a body weight of 155, and am well on my way to finally pulling 600 pounds for the first time ever. The point is, if you dedicate some time and real effort to this exercise, it will pay off in dividends by rewarding you with a strong, resilient lower back, as well as incredibly powerful glutes and hamstrings. I would imagine that most of you guys who probably deadlift somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds will be able to start off with at least 75 to 100 pounds on this exercise, and will easily be able to work that up way higher with a bit of practice. But you're going to have to find the optimal starting point for yourself with a bit of experimentation. Some of you will have stronger backsides than others. I recommend finding a weight you can get 3 sets of 8 to 12 quality reps with, and doing that once or twice a week, adding 5 pounds every other week for a few months before you begin experimenting with the really heavy stuff. At that point, you can start working in lower rep ranges. I personally would not go below 5 reps and really start pushing your strength levels on this exercise. As far as how to perform the exercise safely and effectively, there are really only a few key points. One, as I said earlier, the spine must remain neutral and all the movement should take place via hip flexion and extension. In order to accomplish this, you'll want to set the bench in a spot where the pad extends out only as far as your hips, but no further. This will allow you to hinge around the hips to create movement. Whereas if you let the pad sit farther out, you'll be forced to go into spinal flexion. 2, as you lower yourself, focus on your hamstrings. You'll be able to put them under a large stretch with an immense amount of tension as you descend. They're going to get sore and they're going to get strong. This is also a great hypertrophy stimulus. And 3, focus on the glutes as you finish each rep. At about the midway point, the hamstrings have basically done their part. The stretch reflex has faded, and the glutes must take over to create a powerful and full extension of the hips. Focus on contracting them as hard as possible as you reach the lockout. Do not compensate by using the lower back, and do not hyperextend it as you reach the top. If you do either of these things, you're only shortchanging the strength your glutes could be developing and putting your lower back at risk of injury. So do yourself a favor and lower the weight. One last thing about how to perform them. I mentioned Rubish earlier. He performs them using a barbell held at arm's length, and he allows the bar to settle on the floor between reps. This eliminates the stretch reflex and shortens the range of motion a good bit. On the other hand, I like to bear hug a dumbbell get as deep of a stretch on my hamstrings as I can, and pump out reps continuously through a longer range of motion without ever resetting on the floor. I've tried both ways, and I felt using the barbell was cumbersome, and that the range of motion was too short, even when gripping as wide as possible on the bar and using 25-pound plates to load it. I also dislike the elimination of the stretch reflex and don't feel that performing the exercise with this level of specificity is necessary to make it have carryover to your deadlifts. This is also going to deaden the hypertrophy stimulus and eliminate much of the benefits for enhancing athleticism. But ultimately, I recommend trying both ways and seeing which one you have better results with personally. But if you decide you like my way better, you're going to need to find a way to load the weight, because most gyms don't stock dumbbells beyond 150 pounds, and eventually you will run out of dumbbells. So far, the best thing I've found is to buy a piece of 1-inch diameter pipe that's about 24 inches long from the hardware store. It only costs a few dollars, and along with a couple pairs of clamps to hold the weights in place, you now have yourself a giant dumbbell with basically infinite loading capacity. I've gone up to 220 pounds so far, no problem, and I still have room for plenty more weight. I considered trying to build a harness apparatus of some sort that would loop around the upper back with the weights kind of dangling below you, but I figured building that prototype would be too much of a pain in the ass to work out logistically, so I dropped the idea, and a giant dumbbell is the best I have to offer you guys right now. If anyone else wants to build something like that though, let me know if you do, because that would be freaking awesome. Alright, and this video has dragged on long enough, so truly the last thing I want to say is the really great thing about this exercise that no one without practical experience could ever tell you is it's super effective. It's a fantastic adjunct to deadlift training. Actually, one of the best deadlift assistance exercises in existence, and hands down the most underrated posterior chain exercise there is. But in spite of these amazing benefits, it's not super taxing on the body. You could work your way up to doing 3 to 5 sets of different rep ranges 3 or maybe even more times a week if you wanted to, while still deadlifting and not over-tapping your recovery abilities. It simply doesn't stress the lower back or the CNS in the same manner as other deadlift variations, but it provides just as much of a return on investment. This allows you to perform very high volumes of high quality work without digging yourself into a hole, which in the long run is going to pay off in spades, whether your goal is maximal strength, hypertrophy, increased athletic performance, or some combination of all three. Anyway, that's all I got for now, guys. Please be sure to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And if you're interested in online coaching, be sure to shoot me an email at enkiri.elite@gmail.com. Also, if you truly liked the video or found it helpful, do me a favor and share it somewhere. We're about 1,200 strong now, so let's see if we can finally make this channel blow up. All right, keep training hard, and I'll catch you guys next time.